When The Conqueror was released in 1956, America expected nothing less than a grand Hollywood spectacle. Produced by Howard Hughes, one of the most eccentric moguls in cinema history, and led by John Wayne himself in the unlikely role of Genghis Khan, the film seemed destined to be remembered. Yet, what remains unforgettable today is not the sweeping desert scenes or the melodramatic dialogue, but the dark shadow that hangs over its cast and crew. This was the film later called Cursed, a production many believe carried death in its dust. For behind the bright technicolor and grand costumes was a secret setting, the sands of Utah, downwind from a nuclear testing site, where invisible danger clung to every grain of earth that touched the actor's skin. Audiences in 1956 could not have known this. They saw a Hollywood epic meant to rival any biblical saga, with Susan Hayward glowing as the fierce Bortai and John Wayne projecting his signature authority even in the most improbable role of his career. The movie failed critically, derided for its stilted dialogue and awkward casting. But the true story of The Conqueror emerged not in the box office numbers, but in the years that followed, when one after another, its stars began to vanish. Cancer seemed to stalk the film, claiming lives and fueling whispers of a radioactive curse. More than half the cast and crew would one day fall victim to the disease, and some newspapers would later count as many as 91 cases linked to that production alone. The question then lingers like desert wind, was this simply coincidence, or was Hollywood too quick to gamble with lives for the sake of spectacle? The Conqueror today is often listed among the worst films ever made, but paradoxically, it has become one of the most unforgettable, precisely because of what happened beyond the screen. Its story is not only about artistic failure, but about human tragedy, about the personal cost of cinema's reckless ambition. And in the middle of it all are the actors, larger-than-life figures who carried the burden of fame and, perhaps unknowingly, carried the seeds of their own demise from that cursed desert. John Wayne, Susan Hayward, Pedro Armendáriz, Agnes Moorehead, Thomas Gomez, and William Conrad, names that once glittered on marquees, each with their own struggles, triumphs, and flaws. They were professionals who believed in the film they were making, even if history judged it harshly. Their private lives were filled with success and scandal, their careers with dazzling highs and heartbreaking lows. Some found themselves mocked for their performances, others admired for their grace under pressure. Yet, they all share the same haunting connection, The Conqueror, the film that never let them go. So as we look back nearly 70 years later, we must ask, what are these actors doing now? Their voices are silenced, their lights extinguished, yet their stories remain more alive than ever. Each left behind a legacy marked by artistry and pain, triumph and tragedy, and a final chapter tied inexorably to a movie that should have been forgotten, but never can be. If you want to uncover the real stories of these stars, their rise, their secrets, and their haunting ends, stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold Hollywood legacies. John Wayne, the American cowboy who faced his darkest role in The Conqueror. John Wayne was already a living legend when he accepted the role of Temujin, the man history knows as Genghis Khan. Born Marion Morrison in 1907, Wayne had built his career on playing cowboys and soldiers, embodying rugged American masculinity for more than 2 decades. By the time The Conqueror began filming, he was 48 years old, at the peak of his fame, and a symbol of Hollywood's golden era. Yet, his casting as the Mongol warlord was baffling, even to his most devoted fans. Wayne's familiar drawl and towering presence clashed with the exotic role, and critics later mocked it as one of the worst casting decisions ever made. What seemed like just another chapter in his endless line of heroic portrayals turned into a bitter reminder that even icons could stumble. Wayne's involvement with The Conqueror was not just professional. Howard Hughes, obsessed with bringing epic stories to the screen, reportedly pushed for Wayne in the role despite the obvious misfit. Wayne himself defended his casting, believing that his sheer charisma could carry the part. But history was not kind to him. The film bombed, and Wayne became a target of ridicule for a role many thought tarnished his otherwise unshakable screen image. What no one could have predicted at the time was how much the film would come to haunt him in a far darker way. Years after shooting in the radioactive sands of Utah, Wayne was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Though he battled valiantly and became a symbol of courage for speaking openly about his illness, many pointed to the Conqueror as the beginning of the end. Beyond the professional disappointments and health struggles, Wayne's personal life was equally layered. Known for his conservative politics and commanding presence off-screen, he was both adored and criticized in equal measure. His marriages were tumultuous, his lifestyle heavy with smoking and drinking, but he maintained an image of strength that fans clung to until the very end. When he died in 1979 at the age of 72, it was not just the loss of a man but the fading of an era. His coffin was draped in the American flag, and for millions, Wayne remained the ultimate hero. Yet for those who knew the story of the Conqueror, there was a haunting suspicion that one of Hollywood's greatest stars had been undone not by time, but by the hidden poisons of a disastrous film. Susan Hayward, the tragic queen of Hollywood melodrama. Susan Hayward was born in Brooklyn in 1917, a fiery redhead who grew up with dreams larger than her modest upbringing. By the time she took on the role of Bortai in The Conqueror, she was 38 years old, already one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading ladies. Known for her ability to play women of strength and vulnerability, Hayward brought a fierce energy to the screen, even when the script gave her little to work with. Her casting was meant to lend glamour and emotional weight to a production otherwise dominated by John Wayne's imposing presence, and though critics later dismissed the film as a disaster, no one doubted that Hayward herself carried her role with elegance. Her path to the movie was paved by a decade of success. She had been nominated several times for an Academy Award before finally winning for her electrifying performance in I Want to Live. Just 2 years after The Conqueror. Yet, behind her public triumphs was a private life marked by turbulence. Her marriage to actor Jess Barker was troubled and ended in divorce, leaving her to raise twin sons while navigating the pressures of stardom. Known for her fiery temper as well as her intensity, Hayward was admired and feared in equal measure, a woman who could command the screen and protect her private world with equal force. But like so many of her co-stars, her fate became entangled with the radioactive sands of Utah. Years after shooting The Conqueror, Hayward was diagnosed with brain cancer. Fans were devastated when she passed away in 1975 at the age of 57, far too young for a star whose career still glowed with potential. The eerie pattern of illness among the cast only intensified after her death, and her name was often cited as further proof that the film was cursed. For admirers, the irony was unbearable. A woman who so often played tragic heroines on screen ultimately became one in real life, her strength and glamour cut short by forces beyond her control. Pedro Armendáriz, the Mexican leading man who chose his own ending. Pedro Armendáriz was born in 1912 in Mexico City, a man whose striking looks and magnetic screen presence made him one of the brightest stars of Mexican cinema. By the time he appeared in The Conqueror as Jamuga, he was 44 years old and already celebrated both at home and abroad. Hollywood had taken notice of him years earlier, and he worked with legendary directors like John Ford, building a reputation as a powerful actor who could embody both charm and menace. His role in The Conqueror was that of a rival suitor, and though the film itself failed, Armendáriz's performance carried the same intensity that had defined his career. What brought him to this production was partly his friendship with Ford and his growing stature as one of the few Latino actors to break through into American films of the 1940s and 50s. Yet, his legacy was not only about acting. He was considered a cultural ambassador, embodying Mexican pride on the world stage. Audiences loved him not only for his roles but for the dignity he carried in them. Behind the screen, however, he bore the same fate that would eventually claim so many tied to The Conqueror. In the early 1960s, Armendáriz was diagnosed with cancer, a devastating blow for a man still in his prime. Doctors linked his illness, as with others from the cast, to the toxic environment of the Utah desert where they had filmed. What made his story particularly haunting was the way he faced it. After being cast in the James Bond film From Russia with Love, he pushed himself to complete his scenes despite the pain, unwilling to leave the production unfinished. Soon after, as the disease advanced and the suffering grew unbearable, he made a shocking and deeply personal decision to end his own life in 1963 at just 51 years old. His death left fans mourning not only the loss of a great actor, but the cruel injustice of a man forced into such a tragic choice. Pedro Armendáriz' story resonates because it combines courage, artistry, and a heartbreaking final act of control. He was a star who crossed borders and inspired millions, yet who ultimately could not escape the shadow of the Conqueror. Agnes Moorehead, the intuitive star who felt the shadow of doom. Agnes Moorehead, born in 1900 in Massachusetts, had one of the most versatile careers in Hollywood. By the time she stepped onto the set of The Conqueror at 55 years old, she was already revered for her groundbreaking performance in Citizen Kane and her countless character roles that showcased her range and commanding presence. In The Conqueror, she played Huanluan, the mother figure, a role that required gravitas, and she delivered it with her usual precision. Yet for all her professionalism, Moorehead was uneasy during the shoot. Colleagues later recalled that she expressed concern about the harsh desert environment, as though she sensed an unseen danger lurking in the dust-filled air. Her path to the film was consistent with her career trajectory as one of Hollywood's most sought-after character actresses. She was never the ingenue or the conventional beauty, but instead carved a niche as a woman of intelligence and strength. Audiences came to admire her for that very reason. She was unforgettable, even in smaller roles. After The Conqueror, she went on to even greater fame in the 1960s, becoming a household name as Endora, the witty and flamboyant mother in the hit television series Bewitched. It was a role that brought her endless admiration and an entirely new generation of fans. Behind the laughter and success, however, tragedy was never far. Moorehead's health began to decline, and in the 1970s she was diagnosed with lung cancer. Her death in 1974 at the age of 73 became another link in the grim chain connecting the cast of The Conqueror. Fans who remembered her warnings about the filming location could not help but view her passing as chilling confirmation that she had intuited her fate. What makes her story haunting is not just her loss but the eerie impression that she had foreseen the curse. Agnes Moorehead's legacy is that of a brilliant, commanding actress whose instincts were as sharp as her talent, and whose final years seemed bound to the silent menace of a film she had long distrusted. Thomas Gomez, the character actor whose fate was sealed in the desert. Thomas Gomez was born in New York City in 1905, the son of Spanish immigrants who gave him a strong sense of culture and determination. By the time he appeared in The Conqueror as Wong Khan, he was 51 years old and already a familiar face to American audiences. Known for his deep voice and commanding presence, Gomez built a career as a reliable character actor who could shift seamlessly between menacing villains and sympathetic figures. His casting in The Conqueror reflected that reputation. As a tribal leader, he brought a weight that anchored scenes otherwise weakened by clumsy dialogue and awkward direction. His path to the screen was one of persistence and quiet triumph. Gomez became the first Hispanic actor to be nominated for an Academy Award, earning recognition for his role in Ride the Pink Horse in 1947. That nomination marked him as a trailblazer, someone who quietly broke barriers at a time when Hollywood rarely celebrated actors of diverse backgrounds. Though he never became a household name like John Wayne or Susan Hayward, within the industry he was admired as a craftsman, someone who delivered memorable performances again and again. Yet his story too became entwined with the dark legacy of The Conqueror. Like so many of his co-stars, Gomez's health deteriorated not long after the film, and though his official cause of death in 1971 was a heart attack, his name often appears on the long list of those believed to have been touched by the curse of that desert set. The tragic irony was that a man who had worked so diligently to build his place in Hollywood, overcoming the challenges of being typecast, would be remembered less for his craft and more for his association with a production that brought so much grief. Gomez's life reminds us that even supporting players carry stories as rich as the leads. He left behind a legacy of trailblazing work, and yet his final chapter has become part of a collective tragedy that Hollywood has never truly reconciled. William Conrad, the voice that could not escape the curse. William Conrad was born in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1920, a man whose booming voice and larger-than-life presence made him unforgettable, even when he was not on screen. By the time he lent his narration to The Conqueror, he was 36 years old and already established as one of the great radio stars of his generation. His role in the film was unusual. He never appeared in front of the camera, but his rich, commanding narration framed the story, setting the tone for a production that aspired to epic grandeur. While critics mocked the film's dialogue and casting, Conrad's narration was one of the few elements that carried gravitas, reminding audiences why his voice was considered one of Hollywood's most distinctive assets. Conrad's path to the Conqueror was paved by years of success in radio, where he had been the original voice of Marshall Dillon in the radio version of Gunsmoke. His transition to film and television was not immediate, as his stocky build often worked against Hollywood's narrow view of leading men. Yet Conrad adapted, embracing roles behind the microphone and later finding fame in front of the camera as the star of the television series Cannon and Jake and the Fatman. He became proof that charisma and talent could triumph over typecasting, carving out a career that lasted decades. Still, his connection to the Conqueror placed him within a legacy he could never shake. Though Conrad lived longer than many of his co-stars, dying in 1994 at the age of 73 from heart failure, his name is often recited alongside those who were said to be caught in the film's radioactive curse. Some argued that because his role kept him away from the set more than others, he had escaped the worst of it, yet his later health struggles kept speculation alive. Whether or not the film had a hand in his fate, Conrad's presence as narrator tied him permanently to the most infamous production of his career. His story is one of triumph against the odds and a reminder of how even a voice, unseen on the screen, can become entangled in one of Hollywood's most haunting legends. The Conqueror remains one of Hollywood's most haunting cautionary tales, a film remembered less for its story and more for the grim fates of those who brought it to life. What was intended as an epic romance about Genghis Khan instead became an enduring symbol of hubris, miscasting, and tragedy. When it premiered in 1956, audiences were puzzled by John Wayne's unlikely portrayal, amused by the stiff dialogue, and underwhelmed by the melodrama. Few could have imagined that decades later the movie would be spoken of not for its failures as entertainment but for the shadow it cast over its stars. The desert sands where the film was shot, tainted by nuclear testing, lingered in the public imagination as silent killers. One by one, the names of its cast, John Wayne, Susan Hayward, Pedro Armendáriz, Agnes Moorehead, Thomas Gomez, William Conrad, were linked to cancers and illnesses that turned a bad movie into a cursed legend. Looking at these actors now, through the lens of time, we see more than their roles in a single ill-fated production. John Wayne remains the archetype of the American hero, but his decline in health has forever tied him to this disastrous project. Susan Hayward shines in memory as a woman of beauty and grit, whose life was cut short too soon. Pedro Armendáriz's final, haunting choice still shocks admirers who saw in him both courage and despair. Agnes Moorehead, remembered for her instincts and brilliance, left us with the eerie impression that she foresaw the dangers that lay hidden in the Utah sands. Thomas Gomez, the steadfast craftsman, became another name on a tragic list, while William Conrad, the voice that framed the film, carried the weight of association long after his narration faded. Together, they form a tapestry of triumph and tragedy, of legacies both celebrated and haunted. The Conqueror teaches us that cinema is not only about what appears on the screen but also about the invisible costs carried by those who create it. The film has become a symbol of Hollywood's recklessness, of ambition overriding caution, and of the lives that paid the price for a gamble gone wrong. For audiences today, the movie endures as a reminder of mortality, of destiny, and of the cruel irony that even the brightest stars can be dimmed by forces beyond their control. Some succeeded in their careers, others stumbled, some walked away at the peak of their talents, and some were stopped far too soon. Yet all of them, in some way, remain bound together in history, tied forever to the cursed sands of a forgotten desert. If you've been moved by their stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold Hollywood legacies, where the glitter of the silver screen meets the shadows that history tried to bury.